Welcome back to Tech Take this week. I'm Adam Housley in New York, and we're talking about cyber espionage, a topic we've talked actually on Tech Take for a number of times over the last few years about the cyber war that is continuing right now. It's not that if it's going to happen, it's already here. And here to talk about an agreement that the U.S. signed last week with the Chinese that is very controversial is Alex McGeorge. He's the head of threat intelligence at Immunity Inc. You can find them at Immunity Inc. on Twitter. Alex, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
You know, it's interesting because this agreement was announced, the U.S. and the Chinese, this supposedly historic agreement that was going to stop the espionage that goes back and forth between the two nations. But, you know, a lot of people are saying this is strictly just on paper. There's nothing here. The Chinese are notorious for what they do, and they do it trying to hide a lot of times where they're coming from.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. You know, the threat here, obviously, the Chinese economy is in a downturn. So the threat here is, you know, we can really do them some serious damage with sanctions. So I think this may tone down what's going on. I think it has a reasonable chance of doing that, especially when it's, you know, the Chinese facilitating U.S. intellectual property back to their own companies, so like economic espionage, rather than the standard spying that states do on one another. I don't think that's going to change, but I think the real thrust of this was to, you know, keep things like China hacking RSA or Lockheed Martin, keep those a little bit under the, a little bit less frequent than they perhaps otherwise would be.
You know, Alex, I mean, is the threat really the idea that China, you know, is going to try to steal secrets, or the fact that they could disrupt? I mean, I think a lot of folks in the community, high-tech community, are saying that they're more concerned about not so much them stealing, you know, ideas about weaponry or whatever it is, but them actually disrupting infrastructure potentially. Right.
Well, part of what Obama said prior to going into the meeting is he made it very clear, and it was a very interesting point, is that the China and the U.S. agree that they will not use cyber means to disrupt infrastructure when not in a time of war. And I think the translation there is Obama like laying out that if this happens, so for example, if the Eastern Seaboard goes dark and it is China who is responsible, then we can readily view that as an act of war because we signed this piece of paper saying that we wouldn't do it in a time of peace.
Right.
It also keeps the Chinese from, or at least discourages them from trying to practice, you know, compromising some of our critical infrastructure, and that there have been mistakes made by the Chinese team that have turned certain things off that haven't really made the news so much. But it's an interesting sort of article that they've included in the agreement.
You know, I guess the question I have is well, two-part. First of all, it's going to be in a lot of cases it's tough to truly determine who's behind the attack because of they hopscotch around, to put it in layman's terms. But secondary, really, how are we going to enforce this? You mentioned that the Eastern Seaboard goes down and it's determined China has done it, that, you know, it's an act of war, but it's going to be hard to determine that in a lot of cases, and there's going to be most likely other smaller actions that are already being taking place, really, by the Chinese. And I guess, how do you enforce that? I mean, how do you find it? How do you enforce it?
Sure. Okay, so you have a few things. One, I mean, it is difficult to... So attribution can be difficult for corporations, right? But corporations don't have the resources of the U.S. intelligence community. When you're literally monitoring everything that comes in and leaves the country, attribution suddenly becomes a more tractable problem. Additionally, there's this concept of hack back, right? So we know, for example, that you know, the address that we saw that was initiating the attack is probably not the actual address of the attacker. But if we compromise that IP and then the IP that's connecting to that and so forth and so on, you can get back to things like that. And this is a methodology that is really not available to anyone but the US government and military. So I think it is possible for attribution. I think it's a different sort of scale when you're dealing with the resources of the US government. And then in terms of enforcing it, you know, it can be fairly simple in that, you know, okay, you've been caught with your hand in the cookie jar, and as a result, we're going to level these sanctions at you, and that is going to seriously disrupt your economy. You know, whether or not we choose to prove conclusively to the world how we know it was this particular actor is an intelligence question, because then that would, you know, require us to demonstrate that we have this capability, which we may not want to do. But it's certainly something in the toolbox that we can deploy as required.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see, too, how this all plays out, because there is obviously a lot of threats out there, a lot of things we've already faced, Some of it's been reported, others have not been reported, and obviously a lot of security breaches that have already the U.S. has already had to deal with, not only on a federal level but also on a private company level.
Absolutely.
Alex McGeorge, head of threat intelligence at Immunity Inc. You can find more information about Immunity Inc. at immunityinc.com. That's their website, and also on Twitter at Immunity Inc. Alex, appreciate you coming on the show. We'll definitely stay in touch with you. And as you know, this topic is going nowhere. It's only going to get more serious as we move further along each and every day.
That's true. Pleasure to be here.
I'm Adam Housley. This week we're in New York, and you're watching Tech Take.